Hello, everyone, and welcome to another interview in our series of Research Spotlight interviews, where I have the honor to invite prominent researchers from different research fields that are using eye tracking technology to create scientific breakthroughs. And today I have the joy to talk to Nivedita Mani, from a professor of psychology of language from the Göttingen University in Germany, or Georg August Universität Göttingen, if I'm able to pronounce it correctly. Welcome, Nivedita.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you so much for asking me to be here. And I'm really looking forward to what's this got in store for us. So thank you.
In her work, Professor Mani examines the factors underlying word learning in young children, observing it as a result of a dynamic mutual interaction between the environment and the learner, with a particular focus on the learner, what the learner knows, what they are interested in, and their motivation to learn. Since today we're addressing a broader scientific audience, which is mostly united in the interest in the eye tracking technology and using related methods in their work, I would like us to start from kind of very beginning of explaining what psycholinguistics or psychology of language actually is, a field that we actually both come from, and it is very dear to my heart as well. So maybe my first question would be, what would be your personal definition of psycholinguistics?
So my personal definition of psycholinguistics, although I will say I prefer to call it psychology of language because that's kind of what we're interested in doing, is looking at the mechanisms that support our processing and acquisition of language. So the focus is really on those psychological mechanisms and how they are this bulwark for our language processing and acquisition, particularly in young infants. So that's the kind of main focus of our research here.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say is the overarching vision for your research currently?
So for my research, I mean, what you've already said that we describe language acquisition as the result of this dynamic mutual interaction between the child and the environment. And I suppose our overarching goal in working towards this is to identify what the dynamics are in this interaction. So how do child and the environment go through this dance that we believe they have to as the child learns language? At what point does the environment come in, and how does the child come in and shape the environment, and how do they mutually shape one another? So that, I would say, is our main goal.
Yeah, very interesting and complex dance to examine.
Yeah. I do like to call it a dance because I do think it is exactly, it's these going back and forth across time and how these dynamics shape language acquisition.
So you came to Göttingen more than 10 years ago, and there you have established an infant language lab called Wortschatzinsel. And I wanted to ask you to tell us a bit about it. How does that work? How is it to work with children as participants, and what does that require in terms of organization of such a lab?
Yes, we set up Wortschatzinsel in 2010. And this, bear in mind, this was a period when I moved to Germany and I didn't speak any German at that point. So it was a lot of fun setting up a baby lab in this new environment. I was constantly talking to engineers and architects about what the lab should look like. All of that because it's very important to me what our laboratory environment is like when we work with young children. Or better said, it was very important to me what our laboratory environment was like when we work with children, because when I started off, I had this very fixed idea of what the lab needs to be like, and it's maintained in the last 13 years that when you come in, we've got this very colorful environment for the child where babies come in and it's a bright yellow room where the child feels at home. There's lots of toys. And we make sure we put a lot of effort into making sure that the child is comfortable with what's going on, is feeling at ease with us, with the new environment. And then when we actually go on to the testing, we go into a rather gray room where there's a big monitor on one wall, and there's pretty much nothing else in this room apart from gray walls and this monitor. So that the only thing that the child is then presented with and can focus on is this monitor where our stimuli are presented, and we've got our lovely Tobii eye tracker just below that monitor capturing what the child is looking at. And we then replicated this. So we've now grown to about 4 baby labs where we use eye tracking, and we've replicated exactly this across all the 4 labs in my department. But more recently, I feel like the direction we should be going is away from my very sterile gray labs and moving more to the environment that children are actually confronted with when they learn language, and trying to get those messy environments in and seeing to what extent your eye trackers will allow us to capture where babies are looking when they're looking at these environments in all the glorious mess that you children are usually confronted with.
Oh wow, yeah, that is challenging from the technology part, or actually from the experimental design part as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that is definitely a necessary next step at some point.
Yes, absolutely. So, even before we get to the experimental design, we've got a lot of stuff that we still need to get through with regards to our infrastructure, what we're doing with our kids. So, how do we contact our children? How do we get parents coming into the lab? How do we explain what an eye tracker does? Because if you're not from the field, you start getting worried about this infrared light. What is that going to do to my children? And sort of finding ways to tell the parents about what's going on with eye tracking and why it's harmless for the kids that are coming in and taking part in our experiments is also part of our day-to-day business. So making sure we're presenting these environments, these experiments in the way that caregivers are encouraged to participate. Yeah.
That was actually one of the questions I wanted to ask you. I'm very much interested in how technology enhances or facilitates scientific work, but also how it can constrain it to an extent, since you can only examine what can be measured by the technology that exists today. So I wanted to ask you to name some or maybe all of the experimental methods that you use in your research, and also to reflect on the peculiarities or specificities of working with children that are constraining that choice.
Well, for a start, let's talk about the fact that we start off with babies at about 6 months of age, and we go on across early development. So a lot of the participants coming to our lab are not going to provide us with most of the responses that you typically get from studies with psychology undergraduates, which is the most frequently used population in our field. So the field as a whole has had to be very, very creative about putting together paradigms that allow us to see how the child is processing the input that we're giving it, how it's learning, and how we can get reliable indices of the child having learned the words that we're trying to teach it in our paradigms. We use a variety of paradigms in our studies. What I tend to say that our bread and butter paradigm is the eye tracking paradigm. So almost all the studies we do has some component of eye tracking in there. For a very long time, it was, as I mentioned, these very sterile eye tracking studies in the lab where the child was in front of this gray screen, and we present different images to the child, and we present it with auditory stimuli at the same time, and look at how the presented auditory stimulus then influences where the child looks at different images on the screen. So the standard for that is the prediction paradigm that we've done, where we show children a picture of a cake and a picture of a bird, and we say, the boy eats the big cake. And we want to see where the child looks when it hears the word eats or when it hears the word cake. And we anticipate here that the child will look at the picture of the cake even when it hears the words eats, because it's predicting upcoming linguistic input. Recently, and like I said, that's our standard paradigm that we use in most of the studies, that we present children with images on screen and auditory stimuli and look at how the auditory stimuli influence where the child is looking on the screen. More recently, as I've said, we've been trying to move some of this stuff to the real world. So a lot of the stuff that we do now involves children either in interaction with their caregivers or with other peers. So something that we're very proud of now is that we have set up something that we're calling the Dyadic Interaction Platform, which is a touch screen, a transparent touch screen. So it's literally a piece of glass. And then there's baby on one side and mama on the other side. And we project stimuli onto this touch screen through LED projectors so that mom and baby are both looking at exactly the same thing. And we can see how they engage with this touch screen and also where they're looking at any point as they engage with this touch screen, so that we get an idea of language in interaction. So how do babies look at their visual world and try to integrate this visual world with the other person sitting opposite them, as well as the linguistic input that they receive, and bring that all together to infer meaning. So that's sort of taking us out of these sterile laboratory situations to the messy world that the child actually lives in, and trying to find ways to allow us to tap into what kids are doing as they process language.
And this paradigm also includes eye tracking?
Yes, because all the time that babies are moving around and looking at different things, we're tracking their eyes at the entire time. We're also tracking the parents' eyes at the same time. So we get an idea of this transparent screen. It's got two images on it. Which of those images is mom looking at? When does baby start looking at the same image that mom is looking at? Does it follow mom's gaze, or is it going off on its own little path of discovery? To the extent to which children may steer their own language development. So we track their eyes in that study. We track their responses, and we're very excited about what comes out of that.
Exciting. When do you expect something to come out? When are you expecting the first results?
Hopefully very soon. So I just found out this morning that we've just finished testing one of the conditions in this study. So we hope to be presenting that at the next conferences that we're going to, and we'll be writing that up as well. But it's a very rich data set that comes out of this. So there's the touching, there's how much they look at each other, how do they interact with one another. So I anticipate it'll be a while before all of that data is out there, but I imagine that the first results will start coming out soon.
Very exciting. Thank you for mentioning this. So today I wanted us to talk about a body of work that you have recently presented on at an occasion that I had an opportunity to listen to. And in this talk, you've mentioned that learning is a dynamic interaction between the child and the environment, which you already mentioned. And there you presented also 4 hypotheses of how this is to be understood, or that are actually summarizing that body of work. And today I wanted us to reflect on all 4 of them, because I believe they're very interesting and something that not everyone is maybe aware of, or not how everyone understands language development and supports their own children's language development. So the first hypothesis says that what a child hears influences what it pays attention to. So how can we interpret this? What I know is that it has to do with infant-directed speech, or how we tend to talk to infants, somehow even intrinsically, without actually being taught to talk to children that way. So why is this infant-directed speech so important, and how does it influence learning?
Yeah, so one part of what a child hears influences what the child pays attention to is, as you mentioned, it is about the role of infant-directed speech in early language development. So looking at the fact that when we talk to babies, we tend to use this exaggerated register. And the idea here is that not only do infants attend more to infant-directed speech than to adult-directed speech, but also that they learn better from it, that they engage more with people who speak infant-directed speech as opposed to adult-directed speech. But a lot of our work is going further in looking at the interaction between the kind of infant-directed speech that the child hears at home and babies' attention to infant-directed speech. So we had a couple of studies where we've looked at exactly how exaggerated is the infant-directed speech of the caregiver, and looking at the extent to which that is associated with how much attention babies pay to infant-directed speech. And we could actually establish this positive association between mothers whose infant-directed speech was more exaggerated, having children who also attended more to infant-directed speech. Now, this could go in two different directions. So it could either be that the children attends more to infant-directed speech when mommy speaks more exaggerated infant-directed speech because that's what it's used to hearing. Or it could be also that it's the child doing this, that when mommy notices that when she uses a certain kind of infant-directed speech, that attracts her child's attention, that she's then getting this socially contingent response from her child and is therefore using more infant-directed speech and more exaggerated infant-directed speech. We haven't quite tied down the direction of that. So at this stage, all we're saying is we found this association between how exaggerated the mother's infant-directed speech is and how much attention the child pays to it, suggesting there's this close link that we need to be looking at.
But when you say exaggerated, just to clarify, what does that mean? What do you mean by exaggerating it?
It's a very good question, especially because we live in Germany. So one of the first things that we did when we moved to Germany was getting people to record some stimuli for us. And I was coming from my previous position in England, and I was used to British infant-directed speech. And I heard the first recordings that we produced here and was a bit thrown back because I was like, well, that's not what we do when we speak to babies. I didn't have any kids of my own at that point. And got into the literature a little bit more and realized that German infant-directed speech is not very exaggerated at all. But typically when we talk about infant-directed speech, we're talking about the fact that we typically tend to have a more variable prosody, that we tend to stress on particular words more, that we tend to use shorter sentences, that we tend to have longer pauses between particular sentences, that our utterances are more simpler. And if you look at German infant-directed speech, it doesn't tend to have many of these characteristics. So this obviously varies quite considerably across cultures, but in general, that's what we mean when we talk about infant-directed speech.
And what is a practical implication of this finding that parents could take home?
I'm not sure I want to give a recommendation to parents, because I think one thing that we know from our field is that infants learn best and engage best with parents who are comfortable. And we don't want to be making recommendations that a parent should be using more or less infant-directed speech, but rather just should feel as natural and as comfortable as possible in an interaction with the child. And what I usually say when asked about this is, most Germans I speak to have managed to learn their language without being addressed with very exaggerated infant directed speech. So nothing about this is going to have long-term consequences at this populational level. But at the very least, what we want to do is sort of push back against a rather dated notion that we shouldn't be addressing children with infant-directed speech. So we know now that it's actually really great for kids, and we should be speaking to kids in infant-directed speech if that's what feels natural to us. And I think that's the only thing that we would want to push back against, but not making any recommendations that parents should be exaggerating their speech in any way, because, like I said, most Germans I speak to have managed to learn to speak German without very exaggerated infant-directed speech.
Yeah. The second hypothesis is what the child knows influences what it will learn. So at which level of representation does this hold?
Very nice way of asking that. Yeah. So, at what level of representation does it hold? But what the child knows influences what it's going to learn. We've actually looked at this at multiple different levels of representation. I'll talk about a couple of these now, but for us, it started off just with familiarity with a word form. So, not even knowing the meaning of a word, but just having heard a particular sequence of sounds very often. Are you then, do you then attend more to that or a similar sequence of sounds when you hear it in your input? So that's kind of, even at that very basic phonological level. If you've heard a word like Tasse in German, which is cup, are you then going to attend more to sentences that have that or similar sounding words in the sentence? And we found that very often that kind of rudimentary familiarity can already shape attention to the language input. And then we moved on to look at the extent to which that then extends to having familiarity with meaning as well. This was work that we'd been doing, and we found out that Ariel Borowski and colleagues were doing it at exactly the same time, which was really nice because we were both coming out with these results, which were very consistent, suggesting that the number of words a baby knows or how much baby knows about a particular topic influences how easily baby will add more information to its repertoire about that particular topic. So the idea is in keeping with so-called leveraging accounts of learning that suggest that you leverage your knowledge in order to acquire more knowledge. So if you know a lot about something, you can use all that knowledge you know to gain more information. So those are kind of the different levels that we've been looking at with regards to what a baby knows is associated with how easily a baby will learn more about something that it knows about.
Yeah. So this is then relating to the third hypothesis. What the child is interested in influences what it will learn. And there I wanted you to tell us about your famous bear and bugger babies.
Exactly. So that's one of our pet projects where we started going in the direction of bear and bugger babies, as you pointed out. And this came from us looking into individual differences in vocabulary across different children. It's actually inspired by my own children because I have two little boys with very different interests. And as I realized, very different kinds of vocabularies, where my younger kid was asking me about particular things that I had never heard before. So I knew at least it wasn't in my input, but this was something that had caught his fascination, and he wanted to talk to me more about this. And this sent us down the path of examining the extent to which the child's interests may shape vocabulary development, at least early on. So the idea that as a child who is more interested in animals, you might be more likely to learn a new animal name, making you a bear baby. And as a child who's more interested in other things, like maybe vehicles, you might find it easier to learn a new vehicle name, making you, in our terms, a bugger baby. A bugger is German for digger. So And we then decided to examine this in more detail by looking at the extent to which the baby's interests predict which words babies might find easier or harder to learn. So, is a child who's more interested in animals? Does this child find it easier to learn a new animal name? And that was what we could establish early in development, that we do find these interest modulated patterns of language learning. Obviously, this isn't something that continues, that persists across development, because at some point, older kids are just such robust word learners that they're going to learn these words no matter how interested or not they are in a particular topic. But there we do find that interest then goes and shapes further knowledge acquisition. So not necessarily vocabulary acquisition, but it shapes you learning about certain things and retaining that information later.
Yeah, and knowing the words is a necessary prerequisite for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So these two hypotheses combined raise a question in my mind, is about what the child already knows and what it is interested in, and how these two things come together to influence subsequent language learning. So I could ask you, what comes first? Is it the external exposure to a certain topic, which then feeds a child's vocabulary and makes it easier to learn more on that topic? Or is it that children have some intrinsic preferences for certain topics?
That's an excellent question. So, what's driving these individual differences? That's something we're looking at in more detail now in this dyadic interaction platform that I was talking about, because that's exactly the question we have. Now, despite the focus in my research on how children steer their own language acquisition, we've always called learning this interaction between the child and the environment. So I believe the environment plays as much of an important role in steering the path of language acquisition as the child does. But this may vary from across different topics and across different settings. So one of the things that we're looking at in the dyadic interaction platform that I was talking about is looking at the extent to which the child attends to something that mummy has chosen to explore a bit more. Does the child then follow in on what mummy's choosing to explore and then deepen its knowledge on that? Or does it then go off on its own path? I don't think there's going to be one set answer for this. I do think that it is this dance where sometimes the child is off on its own in following its own interests. Sometimes it follows what the partner is doing, the social partner and the task is doing. This is hopefully something we'll have more information about once these first results are in. But for now, I see both of them as playing an important role in steering these individual differences.
And very difficult to disentangle the two and observe them independently, or even find evidence that they are working independently.
Absolutely. So I do think that they are not working independently, that they obviously are in this circle, right? So what you know influences what you're likely to be interested in, because you need to know a little bit of something in order to show some sort of interest in it. And at the same time, what you're interested in is going to influence how much you learn about it. So there's this circle as far as the role of language and of knowledge and interest in acquisition.
Yeah. And finally, the final hypothesis, that children define who they want to learn from, when, if, and how. And so you find that children choose to learn from those individuals that have proven to be trustworthy by telling the truth. And I find that that study very, very interesting, because it is challenging at least my understanding of how naive children are, or the assumption that we all have that they're very naive and can be told anything. So maybe you can tell us a bit more about
Absolutely. So that was a particularly powerful result and a powerful paradigm as well, which actually went against what I was predicting as well, because I kind of thought attention is going to modulate everything that's going on in that study. So briefly, this was a study where we were looking into the extent to which children retrospectively attend more to input from people who have retrospectively proved more reliable than those who have proved themselves unreliable. So it started off with two people who each would point at a particular object and label it differently. So one person points at, I have a little wug here, one person points at it and says, this is a Modi, and the other one points at it and says, this is a Tanu. And that's obviously conflicting information. Now, who's the child going to believe? Is it going to believe that the Modi person was right or the Tanu person was right? And then retrospectively, let's say the Tanu person got a lot of stuff wrong. So the Tanu person would then go on in the study to call an apple a ball and a car a truck or something completely different. And the Modi person gets it right always and always calls an apple and goes on. And we then looked at, we then showed the kids the same objects and we asked them, where's the Modi? And found that they chose to associate the label provided by the retrospectively reliable person with this object rather than the one who had been unreliable retrospectively, suggesting that they were sort of recalibrating their what they'd learned about this object based on their experience with the person who provided them with this label. So they are actively attending more to information from particular sources than from other sources and using that to sort of shape their language acquisition.
Yeah, this for me has been a very very surprising finding. Let's say that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then finally, now that we have covered all four, one topic that is very interesting for me personally, but I believe also for many people because we are living in an increasingly multilingual environment, is the topic of bi or multilingualism. And you have also looked into language learning beyond monolingualism, but maybe you can reflect in the context of these four hypotheses if there are any differences that one would be expecting with multilingual children.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I can imagine numerous differences with multilingual children, which are all raising avenues for future research that need to be investigated. So when we talk about what the child knows influencing being associated with what the child learns, so is it knowledge in a specific language that then influences it, or can the child leverage knowledge from another language, conceptual knowledge that it's acquired in a different language in order to learn particular concepts? To what extent is this language specific? At the same time, it's also about familiarity that we're talking about. To what extent does familiarity in one language then influence learning of the other language? So does word form familiarity in one language, do we use those statistics in learning other languages as well? Is this information somehow shared across the language boundaries? As well as interest, because especially if you see interest as something that's in this feedback loop between the environment and the child's knowledge and the child's own interests, this comes from somewhere, these early interests. Somebody has introduced these topics to you. Somebody has maybe supported your engagement, your continued engagement with this particular topic. To what extent is that then associated with the language that you speak with that person, and how does that then influence later development in that language or across all languages? So these are all fascinating questions that I'm afraid we haven't started looking at yet, but I hope we will be looking at in the future. What we do know about multilingualism is that the boundaries aren't as sharp as one would think across these two languages, especially early in development. That obviously a lot of knowledge from one language is being used as you process the other language as well. So there's a lot of interaction across these two languages of a child. and that this influence does not just go from your first language to your second language, but your second language can equally influence your processing of your first language as well. So it's not a unidirectional effect of the first language on second language acquisition, but it goes both ways. At least early in development, we see there's a lot of crosstalk between the two languages.
Mm-hmm. All right, since the clock is ticking, I would like to continue talking to you for much longer, but since the clock is ticking, let's wrap up. And for as the last question, I would like to go back to eye tracking as a research method and ask you, as an expert in eye tracking, from your extensive experience and the current perspective of where you stand today, what would you advise those who are considering to adopt eye tracking in working with children, so in different sorts of developmental research? What would be your advice?
So my advice for those starting with eye tracking research is to maybe not go the same route that I did. And this is something I'm very passionate about now, that we don't go for these very sterile eye tracking setups, but we actually look at language in the real world and move away from them and start coming up with more innovative solutions to look at how language and the child's interaction with the visual world are integrated in the real world where language actually takes place. That may tell us a little bit more about how children actually learn language than our sterile setups in the lab. Not that we still have a lot of these sterile setups going on. We still have our bread and butter studies that we're doing with eye tracking in our labs, but maybe that's where we should be going next, is moving things out into the real world.
Mm-hmm. That was a surprising answer, but a very logical one. There is a large body of work in those sterile labs, and it is time to take the step into the wild, beyond.
I think that's where we need to go. We need to go out in the wild.
Yeah. So, Nivedita, it was a pleasure talking to you today. I hope this conversation on infant language learning and eye tracking will be useful for many and beneficial for them. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the great questions. It's always nice to sit back and think about all of this a bit more. So thank you.